Swiss A220-300 Cockpit landing in storm at Milan Malpensa. I demand you divert this aircraft immediately, Captain. I have an urgent business meeting in Milan that cannot be delayed. Sir, we will land in Milan when it is safe to do so, and not a moment before. The words hung in the tense air of the Swiss A220-300 Cockpit as Captain Andreas Müller maintained his focus on the instruments before him. Outside the windscreen, the Italian Alps were completely obscured by churning gray clouds that buffeted the aircraft with increasing violence. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the storm system that had descended upon Milan Malpensa Airport with unexpected fury. First Officer Claudia gripped her controls as another powerful gust sent the aircraft lurching sideways. In the cabin behind them, passengers gasped and clutched their armrests. And standing in the cockpit doorway, against every regulation and safety protocol, was Markus Reinhardt, billionaire industrialist, Swiss Airlines board member, and at this moment, the most dangerous obstacle between this aircraft and a safe landing. The situation had deteriorated rapidly in the last 10 minutes. What had begun as a routine approach to Milan Malpensa had transformed into one of the most challenging landings either pilot had faced in their careers. Wind shear warnings screamed from the aircraft systems. The ATIS Automatic Terminal Information Service was reporting gusts up to 48 knots, well above normal operating limits. The tower had already diverted 3 aircraft to alternate airports, and now Markus Reinhardt refused to leave the cockpit. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," Claudia said firmly, her Italian accent becoming more pronounced under stress. "We are in a critical phase of flight." But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Captain Andreas Müller had walked through the crew security checkpoint at Zurich Airport, his roller bag clicking rhythmically behind him on the polished terminal floor. Andreas was 54 years old, with silver-threaded hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of 3 decades spent in cockpits. He had logged over 18,000 flight hours, flown everything from turboprops to wide-body jets, and had served as a training captain for the past 8 years. His colleagues respected him not just for his technical skill, but for his unflappable demeanor in crisis situations. Andreas had a saying he often repeated to younger pilots: "Aviation doesn't care about your ego. It only cares about your decisions." That Tuesday morning in late October felt like any other. Andreas had risen at 4:30 in his apartment overlooking Lake Zurich, made his customary strong coffee, and reviewed the weather briefings for the day's flight to Milan. The forecast had shown some afternoon instability over northern Italy, but nothing unusual for autumn in the Alps. Flight LX1630 was scheduled to depart Zurich at 10:15 a.m. and arrive in Milan Malpensa at 11:10 a.m., a short 55-minute hop that Andreas had flown hundreds of times. As he made his way to the crew briefing room, Andreas spotted his first officer for the day. Claudia was 32 years old, a Milan native who had joined Swiss 3 years earlier after flying regional jets in Italy. She was relatively new to the A220, but Andreas had flown with her twice before and appreciated her attention to detail and smooth handling of the aircraft. "Good morning, Captain," Claudia greeted him with a warm smile, her dark eyes bright despite the early hour. "Beautiful morning for flying." "Indeed," Andreas replied, settling into a chair with his flight bag. "Have you seen the latest weather for Milan?" "Just checked. Some convective activity developing, but it should stay south of the airport." Claudia pulled up the meteorological charts on her tablet. "METAR is reporting scattered clouds at 3,000 feet, visibility 10 kilometers. Nothing concerning." Andreas nodded, but something in his experienced gut told him to pay attention to that convective activity. He had learned long ago that weather in the Alps could change with startling speed. "Let's keep monitoring it. I want updates every 30 minutes once we're airborne." They spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the flight plan, fuel calculations, and notices to airmen. The A220-300, they would be flying that day, registration HBJCQ, was one of the newest aircraft in the Swiss fleet. Andreas loved the A220. It was quiet, fuel-efficient, and equipped with some of the most advanced avionics he had ever used. The Pratt & Whitney PW1500G engines were remarkably quiet, and the fly-by-wire system made the aircraft responsive yet stable. Their cabin crew for the flight arrived. Senior Flight Attendant Martina Hoffman, a 48-year-old veteran with 25 years at Swiss, and two younger attendants, Sophie and Lucas. Martina had worked with Andreas many times before, and they had developed the kind of seamless communication that comes from mutual respect and experience. "Morning, everyone," Martina said, placing her bag on the table. "We have a full cabin today, 135 passengers. Several business travelers heading to meetings in Milan, some tourists, and..." She paused, consulting her passenger manifest. "One VIP in business class, Marcus Reinhardt." Andreas raised an eyebrow. He knew the name. Everyone at Swiss knew Marcus Reinhardt. The 67-year-old industrialist had built a manufacturing empire that spanned 12 countries. He was also one of the largest shareholders in Swiss Airlines' parent company and sat on the board of directors. Andreas had never met him personally, but he had heard stories. Reinhardt was known for being demanding, imperious, and accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted when he wanted it. "Let's make sure he has a smooth flight," Andreas said diplomatically. At 9:45, Andreas and Claudia made their way to gate D48, where HBJCQ sat gleaming in the morning sun. The A220's distinctive nose and graceful lines always impressed Andreas, even after hundreds of flights on the type. They conducted their exterior walk-around inspection together, checking the condition of the fuselage, wings, engines, and landing gear. Everything looked perfect. Inside the cockpit, Andreas settled into the left seat while Claudia took the right. The A220's flight deck was modern and ergonomic, dominated by 5 large LCD screens that displayed everything from flight instruments to system synoptics to navigation charts. Andreas began the pre-flight setup, methodically moving through each checklist item. He programmed the flight management system with their route, checked the fuel quantity, 7,200 kilograms, more than adequate for the short flight plus ample reserves, and verified all the aircraft systems. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers were boarding. Martina stood near the entrance, greeting each traveler with practiced warmth. Business class filled first. The A220-300's business cabin featured 20 comfortable seats in a 2-2 configuration. Marcus Reinhardt boarded without acknowledging Martina's greeting, his attention fixed on his phone as he barked orders to someone on the other end. He was tall and lean, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his steel-gray hair swept back from a sharp, angular face. He radiated wealth and authority. Reinhardt took his seat in 2A, the window seat in the first row of business class, and immediately demanded that Sophie bring him an espresso, properly made, not that dishwater you people usually serve. Sophie, only 23 and still relatively new to the job, felt her face flush but maintained her professional composure. "Of course, sir. I'll prepare that right away," he shouted, his voice carrying over the aircraft noise. "This is Marcus Reinhardt, and I'm documenting the criminal incompetence of this flight crew. They're endangering all our lives by attempting to land in this storm when they should have diverted. I'll have their licenses revoked." A violent jolt threw him off balance, and he crashed into the seats across the aisle. 2 passengers helped him up, but Reinhardt was beyond reason now. He pushed past them and staggered forward toward the cockpit door. Martina saw him coming and unstrapped herself, moving to intercept him again. "Sir, return to your seat immediately." "Get out of my way." Reinhardt shoved her aside with surprising strength. Martina stumbled but caught herself on a seat back. Reinhardt reached the cockpit door and pounded on it with his fist. "Captain, I order you to divert this aircraft now. Do you hear me? I'm ordering you." In the cockpit, Andreas and Claudia were at a critical phase of the approach. They had descended through 10,000 feet and were being vectored for the final approach course. Every ounce of their concentration was focused on flying the aircraft and monitoring the weather. "Swiss 1630, turn left heading 180, descend to 4,000 feet, cleared ILS runway 35R approach," the Milan controller said. "Left heading 180, descend to 4,000, cleared ILS 35R, Swiss 1630. The pounding on the cockpit door came like a hammer blow. Both pilots jerked their heads around in shock. What the hell? Claudia said. Andreas was already reaching for the interphone when the pounding intensified. Over the intercom, they could hear Reinhardt's voice. Open this door, that's an order. Jesus, Andreas muttered. He pressed the interphone button. Martina, what's happening? Captain, I'm sorry, Mr. Reinhardt forced his way forward. I couldn't stop him. He's demanding entry to the cockpit. Andreas felt a surge of anger. They were at 4,000 feet, descending through severe weather on approach to an airport with active windshear warnings, and now they had to deal with this. He made a split-second decision. Martina, I'm opening the door for 1 second. Pull him back if you can. Claudia, you have the aircraft. I have the aircraft, Claudia confirmed, taking control. Andreas reached up and unlocked the cockpit door, pulling it open just a crack. Sir, you need to. Reinhardt shoved the door open with surprising force, pushing his way into the cockpit. I demand you divert this aircraft immediately. Don't you know who I am? I'm Marcus Reinhardt, and I'm on the board of this airline. Sir, get out of my cockpit now, Andreas said, his voice deadly calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made even Reinhardt pause. I will not. You're endangering lives with your reckless decision to land in this storm. I have a critical meeting that cannot be delayed, and windshear alert, windshear alert. The aircraft's automated warning system suddenly blared through the cockpit. Both pilots' attention snapped back to their instruments. Go around thrust, Andreas commanded, his hand already reaching for the thrust levers, but Claudia had already reacted. Years of training took over, bypassing conscious thought. She pushed the thrust levers all the way forward to the takeoff go-around detent. The engines howled to full power. Simultaneously, she pulled back on the side stick, pitching the nose up to 15 degrees. The A220 shuddered and bucked as it flew through the windshear, a sudden change in wind from a 30-knot headwind to a 15-knot tailwind in less than 3 seconds. The aircraft's vertical speed indicator showed them sinking despite the climb pitch. The ground proximity warning system joined the windshear alert. Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up. Andreas grabbed the other set of controls, adding his input to Claudia's. Full thrust, hold the pitch, hold the pitch. The aircraft was at 3,200 feet. 3,000, 2,900. The descent was slowing, but they were still sinking. Reinhardt, standing in the cockpit doorway, finally understood the gravity of the situation. His face went white as he gripped the back of the jump seat. All thoughts of meetings and demands evaporated in the face of genuine mortal terror. 2,800 feet, 2,750 feet. The descent rate was decreasing 500 feet per minute, 400, 300, and then they were climbing. The windshear had released its grip. The vertical speed indicator swung positive. 3,000 feet, 3,200, 3,500. Windshear event clear, the automated voice announced. The warnings fell silent. Andreas and Claudia were both breathing hard, adrenaline surging through their systems. That had been close, far too close. Another few seconds and they would have impacted the ground. Climbing, Claudia said, her voice remarkably steady. Heading 180, climbing through 4,000. Swiss 1630, Milan approach, we saw your deviation. Are you okay? Andreas took a breath to steady himself before responding. Milan, Swiss 1630, we encountered severe wind shear at 3,000 feet. We executed a go-around, requesting vectors for another approach. There was a pause. Swiss 1630, conditions at Malpensa continue to deteriorate. Wind is now 290 at 30 gusting 50. We have 2 more wind shear alerts reported from other aircraft. Strongly recommend diverting to Bergamo or Verona. Both fields are reporting VFR conditions. Andreas didn't hesitate this time. The weather was getting worse, not better. They had attempted one approach and nearly died because of it. The decision was clear. Milan approach, Swiss 1630 is diverting to Bergamo. Request vectors. Swiss 1630, Roger. Turn right heading 90, climb and maintain 6,000 feet. Contact Milano Control on 119.8. Right heading 90, climb to 6,000, contact 119.8, Swiss 1630. Only then did Andreas turn his attention to Marcus Reinhardt, who was still standing in the cockpit doorway, his face ashen, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. Sir, we will land in Milan when it is safe to do so, and not a moment before. Andreas repeated his earlier words, but now the full weight of their meaning was unmistakable. That wind shear nearly killed us. If First Officer Bianchi hadn't reacted instantly, we would have crashed. And you standing in this cockpit during a critical phase of flight violated federal aviation regulations and endangered every life on this aircraft. The words brought us full circle to where we started, in that moment of crisis with Reinhardt's demand and Andreas's calm refusal. But now the immediate emergency had passed. They were climbing away from the storm, away from the deadly windshear, heading for the safety of Bergamo Airport 25 miles to the east. Reinhardt tried to muster some defense. I didn't realize, you didn't realize because you didn't care to realize, Andreas interrupted, his calm demeanor hiding the fury he felt. You cared only about your meeting, your schedule, your importance. You threatened my crew. You violated the cockpit. You distracted us during a critical approach. Mr. Reinhardt, when we land, you will be met by the Polizia di Stato, and I will personally file a report with the Italian aviation authorities and Swiss Airlines security. Now, Captain, there's no need for such drastic measures, Reinhardt said, attempting to recover some authority. I'm on the board of directors. I can make this very difficult for you. Get out of my cockpit. Each word fell like a hammer. Martina, please escort Mr. Reinhardt to his seat and ensure he remains there for the remainder of the flight. Martina had appeared behind Reinhardt, and now she placed a firm hand on his arm. Come with me, sir. For a moment, Reinhardt looked as if he might argue further, but he saw something in Andreas's eyes, the unshakable authority of a captain who had just saved 137 lives, and his remaining bluster collapsed. He allowed Martina to lead him back to his seat. The cockpit door closed and locked behind them. Andreas and Claudia sat in silence for a moment, letting the adrenaline slowly ebb from their systems. The aircraft continued its climb through the turbulent clouds, heading east toward clearer skies. That was excellent flying, Claudia, Andreas said finally. Your windshear recovery was textbook perfect. You saved this aircraft. Claudia let out a shaky breath. I've practiced that procedure 100 times in the simulator. I never thought I'd need it in real life. Now you know why we practice. Well done. They leveled off at 6,000 feet and contacted Milano Control, who provided vectors to Bergamo's Orio al Serio airport. The clouds began to thin as they flew east, and within 10 minutes they broke into clear air. Below them, they could see Bergamo Airport, a single long runway with a small terminal, bathed in afternoon sunlight. It looked like paradise after the hell they had just experienced. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Müller. Andreas picked up the PA microphone, and his voice carried through the cabin. I apologize for the dramatic last few minutes. We encountered severe wind shear during our approach to Milan Malpensa that made a safe landing impossible. We have diverted to Bergamo Airport, where we will land in approximately 10 minutes. The weather here is excellent, and we expect a smooth landing. Swiss has been notified of our diversion, and they will arrange ground transportation to Milan for all passengers. Once again, I apologize for the inconvenience, and I thank you for your patience and understanding. In seat 2A, Marcus Reinhardt stared out the window, his hands trembling slightly. He was reliving those terrible seconds when the windshear alert had sounded, when he had seen the terror on the pilots' faces, when he had realized that his demands and his importance meant nothing in the face of the laws of physics and aerodynamics. He had nearly killed everyone on this aircraft, including himself. His €40 million meeting suddenly seemed absurdly trivial. The approach to Bergamo was smooth and uneventful. The A220 descended through clear skies, configured for landing with flaps and gear extended, and touched down on runway 28 with barely a bump. Andreas deployed the thrust reversers and brought the aircraft to a smooth stop on the taxiway. Applause erupted in the cabin passengers expressing relief and gratitude. Welcome to Bergamo, Andreas said over the PA. Local time is 12:45 p.m. We apologize again for the diversion and delay. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate. As they taxied to the terminal, Andreas could see emergency vehicles positioned nearby, standard procedure for an aircraft that had declared a weather emergency. And beyond them, he saw 2 police cars with flashing lights. The Italian aviation authorities had been notified of the cockpit intrusion, and they were taking it seriously. The aircraft parked at the gate, and Andreas shut down the engines. In the sudden silence, he and Claudia looked at each other. "That's one for the memoirs," Claudia said with a weak smile. "Indeed. Come on, let's face the music." They opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. The passengers were gathering their belongings, most looking relieved to be safely on the ground. Several passengers approached Andreas to thank him and Claudia for their handling of the situation. One elderly gentleman, probably in his 70s, shook Andreas's hand firmly. "Captain, I'm a retired pilot myself, flew DC-3s and 707s back in the day. That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. You kept your head when many would have panicked. Thank you for getting us down safely." "Thank you, sir," Andreas said, genuinely touched. "That means a great deal." Martina approached with 2 Italian police officers. "Captain Müller, these officers need to speak with you about the incident." Andreas nodded. "Of course." "First Officer Bianchi, would you complete the post-flight duties? I'll handle this." The senior officer, a stern-faced man in his 50s named Inspector Rixai, introduced himself in excellent English. "Captain Müller, we have been briefed by Milano Control about the cockpit intrusion during your approach. We need to take statements from you, your crew, and the passenger involved, Mr. Marcus Reinhardt." "I understand, Inspector. I'll provide a full written report as well." Marcus Reinhardt was standing near his seat, looking smaller somehow than he had earlier. The bravado, the arrogance, the sense of untouchable privilege, all of it had evaporated. He looked like what he was, a frightened 67-year-old man who had come face to face with his own mortality. As Inspector Rixai approached him, Reinhardt held up a hand. "Inspector, before you say anything, I want to speak to Captain Müller." Rixai looked at Andreas, who nodded. "It's all right." Reinhardt stepped forward, and Andreas saw that there were tears in the older man's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "Captain Müller, I owe you my life. I owe everyone on this aircraft their lives. What I did was inexcusable. I was arrogant, reckless, and criminally stupid. I put my own selfish concerns above the safety of 135 innocent people. I interfered with you during a critical phase of flight. I could have caused a catastrophe." He paused, struggling to continue. "My father was a Swissair pilot. He flew DC-8s in the 1960s and 70s. He taught me to respect aviation, to respect the authority of the captain. He would be ashamed of me today. I am ashamed of myself." The transformation was so complete, so genuine, that Andreas felt his anger softening. He had seen this before. People who came face to face with death often emerged changed, stripped of the petty concerns and egos that had dominated their lives. "Mr. Reinhardt," Andreas said quietly, "what you did was indeed dangerous and illegal, but I believe you understand that now. The Italian authorities will make the final decision about charges, and Swiss will certainly conduct an investigation. For my part, I accept your apology, and I hope this experience teaches you something about humility and respect for the people who work to keep you safe." Reinhardt nodded, unable to speak. Inspector Rixai took Reinhardt aside for questioning, while another officer interviewed Andreas. The captain provided a detailed account of the entire flight, from the initial holding pattern through the Windshear encounter and subsequent diversion. He was careful to be factual and unemotional, letting the events speak for themselves. After 45 minutes, Inspector Rixai approached Andreas again. "Captain Müller, based on your statement and the statements of your crew, it's clear that Mr. Reinhardt violated multiple regulations regarding cockpit security and interference with flight operations. However, he has been extremely cooperative, has expressed genuine remorse, and has indicated he will make no attempt to use his position to avoid consequences. Given his age, his lack of prior offenses, and the fact that no one was ultimately harmed, we will not be filing criminal charges at this time. However, we are issuing a formal citation, and he will be banned from interfering with flight crew operations on any aircraft in European airspace. This will also be reported to Interpol and the FAA. I understand, Inspector. Thank you for your professionalism. Thank you for your outstanding airmanship, Captain. Italy is fortunate you were at the controls today." As the police wrapped up their investigation, Swiss had arranged 3 buses to transport the passengers from Bergamo to Milan. The airline had also rebooked anyone who needed onward connections and was providing hotel accommodations for those whose travel plans were disrupted. It was expensive and logistically complex, but it was the right thing to do. Andreas, Claudia, Martina, Sophie, and Lucas stood near the gate, watching the passengers file onto the buses. Most were in good spirits despite the delay, chatting and laughing with the relief of people who had been through an ordeal together and emerged safely. Marcus Reinhardt was the last to board. Before stepping onto the bus, he turned back to face the crew one final time. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say, but he placed his hand over his heart and bowed slightly. It was a gesture of respect, of genuine gratitude. Andreas nodded in acknowledgement. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important lessons in life come when we least expect them, delivered in ways we never anticipated. The buses departed, and the terminal fell quiet. Andreas and his crew had their own transportation arranged. Swiss was sending a car to take them back to Zurich. They would have to complete extensive paperwork about the incident, and there would be meetings with the chief pilot and safety committee. But all of that could wait until tomorrow. For now, they sat in a quiet corner of the Bergamo terminal, drinking espresso and decompressing from the most eventful flight of their careers. "Captain," Sophie said tentatively, "I'm sorry I couldn't stop Mr. Reinhardt from reaching the cockpit. I should have—" "Sophie, stop," Andreas interrupted gently. "You did everything you could. Martina did everything she could. That man was determined to force his way forward, and short of physically tackling him, which could have injured passengers in that turbulence, there was nothing more you could have done. You all performed admirably." "What do you think will happen to him?" Lucas asked. "He's on the board of directors. Will he really face consequences?" Andreas shrugged. "That's not my concern. I did my job, which was to safely operate that aircraft and protect my passengers and crew. What happens to Mr. Reinhardt now is up to the airline and the authorities, but I suspect his time on the board is over. Even if they don't fire him, I can't imagine he'll have the stomach to stay after today." Claudia stared into her espresso cup. "When that windshear hit, Andreas, we were seconds from impact. I could see it on the radar altimeter. We dropped below 2,700 feet. The ground was right there. But you reacted perfectly," Andreas said. "You didn't freeze, you didn't panic. You executed the windshear escape procedure exactly as trained. That's why we practice these things over and over in the simulator, so when the real emergency comes, the correct actions are automatic. You should be proud, Claudia. You're a damn fine pilot." Claudia smiled, the tension finally starting to leave her shoulders. "Thank you, Captain. I learned from the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching travelers hurry past with their rolling bags, announcements echoing through the terminal in Italian and English, the ordinary rhythms of airport life continuing all around them. To everyone else in this terminal, it was just another Tuesday afternoon. But for Andreas and his crew, this would be a day they remembered for the rest of their lives. Andreas's phone buzzed. It was a text from the Swiss chief pilot. "Heard about your diversion and the incident. Everyone's safe. Need anything?" He typed back. "All safe. Excellent crew work. Detailed report to follow, heading home now." The response came immediately. "Well done, Andreas. Always trust your judgment. See you tomorrow." That simple message meant more to Andreas than any award or commendation. The trust of his colleagues, earned over 3 decades of consistent professionalism, was the foundation of his career. He had never abused that trust, never cut corners, never let external pressure compromise his decisions. And today, that integrity had saved lives. Their ride arrived, a comfortable Mercedes van, and they loaded their bags. As they pulled away from Bergamo Airport, Andreas looked back at the terminal one last time. Somewhere out there, Marcus Reinhardt was on a bus to Milan, probably missing his €40 million meeting, his phone undoubtedly exploding with angry messages from business partners. But he was alive. They were all alive. That was what mattered. The drive back to Zurich took about 3 hours, winding north through the Italian Alps into Switzerland. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. They crossed the border at Chiasso, and Andreas felt the familiar sense of homecoming as they entered Swiss territory. By the time they reached Zurich Airport, it was early evening. The crew said their goodbyes in the parking garage, promising to meet for dinner once the official investigation concluded. There would be paperwork to complete, meetings to attend, possibly recurrent training to refresh their windshear recovery procedures. But all of that was routine. the bureaucratic aftermath of an unusual event. Andreas drove home to his apartment overlooking Lake Zurich. His wife, Elizabeth, was waiting for him, and she knew immediately from his expression that something significant had happened. "Bad day?" she asked, embracing him. "Eventful day," he corrected, holding her close. "Very eventful. I'll tell you everything, but first, I just want to hold you for a moment." They stood there in the entrance of their apartment, husband and wife, and Andreas felt the last of the tension drain from his body. He was home, he was safe, his crew was safe, his passengers were safe, everything else was details. Later that evening, over dinner, Andreas told Elizabeth the entire story. She listened without interrupting, her hand occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze his. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know what strikes me most about this story?" she said finally. "It's not the windshear, as terrifying as that must have been. It's not even the man forcing his way into the cockpit. It's the transformation. This Marcus Reinhardt, he sounds like he was completely changed by the experience." Andreas nodded slowly. "Yes, I've seen it before, though never quite so dramatically. When people truly understand how fragile life is, how quickly everything can end, it changes them. Some become fearful and paralyzed. Others become grateful and purposeful. I think Reinhardt might be the latter. Will you see him again?" "I doubt it. The aviation world is smaller than you'd think, but I suspect Mr. Reinhardt will be keeping a very low profile for a while." But Andreas was wrong about that. 3 days later, he received a package at the Swiss crew base. Inside was a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, along with a small wooden box. The letter read, "Dear Captain Müller, I am writing to express my gratitude and to offer what inadequate apology words can convey. Since our flight, I have been unable to sleep without seeing those moments in the cockpit. The windshear alarm, your calm commands, First Officer Bianch's lightning reflexes, and my own shameful behavior. I have resigned from the Swiss Airlines Board of Directors, effective immediately. I have also established a fund of 5 million Swiss francs to support aviation safety training and research, to be administered by the European Aviation Safety Agency. If my foolishness that day can somehow contribute to making flying safer for others, then perhaps some good can come from my terrible judgment. The enclosed box contains my father's wings, the pin he wore during his 30 years as a Swissair captain. He gave it to me on his deathbed, making me promise to always honor the aviation profession and the people who dedicate their lives to it. I broke that promise last Tuesday. I don't deserve to keep these wings, but you do. You are everything my father was, skilled, calm under pressure, decisive, and above all, committed to the safety of those in your care. I missed my meeting in Milan that day. The 40 million euro deal fell through. My business partners were furious. At the time, I thought it was a catastrophe. Now I realize it was the best thing that could have happened to me. That meeting, that deal, that money, none of it matters. What matters is that 137 people went home to their families that night because of your skill and judgment. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I should have learned 50 years ago. And thank you for doing what you do, flight after flight, year after year, keeping people safe in a profession where there is no room for error. With profound respect and gratitude, Marcus Reinhardt, Andreas opened the small wooden box. Inside, nestled on velvet, was a pair of gold Swissair captain's wings from the 1960s, worn smooth by decades of wear. He held them in his hand, feeling their weight, imagining the man who had worn them, Marcus Reinhardt's father, flying DC-8s across the Atlantic when aviation was younger and perhaps more romantic, but no less demanding of skill and dedication. He showed the letter and wings to Elizabeth that evening. "Will you keep them?" she asked. Andreas considered. "Yes. Not for myself, but as a reminder. We never know how our actions will affect others. I was just doing my job that day, following my training, making the decisions I knew were correct. But to Marcus Reinhardt, it was a life-changing moment. These wings represent that, the power we have as aviators to not just transport people from one place to another, but to occasionally transform their understanding of what's important in life. Your father would be proud of you," Elizabeth said softly. "I hope so. I hope all the pilots who came before me would be proud. We're all links in a chain that stretches back to the earliest days of flight, a chain of professionalism, skill, and dedication to safety. Every time we close a cockpit door and start the engines, we're carrying on that tradition. The investigation into the incident concluded 2 weeks later. The Swiss Safety Committee reviewed Andreas's decisions and actions and found them completely appropriate. His choice to attempt one approach, his windshear recovery, his decision to divert all were deemed correct and in accordance with standard operating procedures. Claudia received a commendation for her outstanding airmanship during the windshear encounter. Martina and her cabin crew were praised for their handling of a difficult passenger situation. Marcus Reinhardt kept his promise. The 5 million franc safety fund was established and began funding research into improved windshear detection systems and pilot training programs. Reinhardt himself mostly disappeared from public life, devoting his time to his family and quietly supporting aviation charities. Andreas never saw him again, but he heard through the industry grapevine that Reinhardt had become an advocate for aviation safety and was using his wealth and influence to improve training standards and equipment across Europe. The man who had once threatened to have a flight attendant fired for doing her job now spent his time supporting the people who kept passengers safe. 6 months after the incident, Andreas was conducting simulator training for new A220 captains at the Swiss Training Center. During a session on windshear recovery procedures, one of the student pilots, a young woman named Sarah, who reminded Andreas of Claudia, asked him about his real-world experience. "Captain Müller, have you ever encountered actual windshear?" Andreas smiled. "Once, at Milan last October. Would you like me to set up the scenario in the simulator so you can practice the same conditions I faced?" "Yes, please." Andreas programmed the simulator with the exact conditions from that day: the wind speeds, the storm cells, the terrain, the wind shear onset at 3,000 feet. Sarah flew the approach with intense concentration. When the wind shear alert sounded, she executed the escape procedure but a moment too slowly. The simulator crashed into the ground. "Let's try again," Andreas said calmly. "Remember, the instant you hear that warning, you must react. Not think, not analyze, react. Full thrust, pitch up, ride it out. Your training has programmed the correct responses into your muscle memory. Trust your training." Sarah tried again. This time, when the wind shear hit, she reacted immediately and the simulator climbed away from danger. "Excellent," Andreas said. "That's exactly right. Now you understand why we practice these procedures until they're automatic. In the real emergency, you won't have time to think. You'll just act." "Captain," Sarah said after the simulation ended, "what was going through your mind when the real wind shear hit?" Andreas thought back to that day, the alarm blaring, Claudia's instant reaction, the ground rushing up at them, Marcus Reinhardt standing in the cockpit doorway with terror on his face. "Honestly, my mind was completely clear. No fear, no panic, just focus on the immediate actions needed. That's what training does, it gives you clarity when chaos threatens." "And after, when you landed safely, what did you feel?" "Gratitude. Gratitude that my training was adequate, that my crew was excellent, that our aircraft performed as designed, and that everyone walked away safely. And humility, because I know that on another day, with slightly different circumstances, the outcome could have been very different. We can do everything right and still face situations where luck plays a role. That's why we always prepare for the worst and hope for the best." Sarah nodded, absorbing the wisdom of a captain who had faced the worst and prevailed through skill, training, and calm judgment. That evening, Andreas drove home through Zurich in the gentle rain of a spring evening. He thought about all the flights he had made over his 30-year career, thousands of takeoffs and landings, millions of miles, hundreds of thousands of passengers safely transported. Most of those flights were routine, forgettable. But occasionally, very occasionally, a flight became something more, a test, a challenge, a moment when everything he had learned and trained for was put to the ultimate examination. He thought about Marcus Reinhardt, transformed by a brush with death into someone better, humbler, more connected to what truly mattered. He thought about Claudia, whose lightning-fast reactions had saved them all. He thought about Martina and her crew, maintaining order and safety in the cabin despite the chaos. He thought about all the pilots who had come before him, whose accumulated knowledge and experience had been passed down through generations of aviators, each adding to the collective wisdom of the profession. And he thought about all the flights still to come, all the passengers still to be carried safely to their destinations, all the young pilots still to be trained. The work continued, flight after flight, day after day, as it had since the dawn of aviation and would continue long after he retired. Andreas parked his car and walked into his apartment building. Elizabeth had dinner waiting, and they would eat together and talk about their day, and tomorrow he would wake early and go to the airport and fly again. It was a good life, he reflected, a life of purpose and meaning, a life spent mastering a demanding craft, a life dedicated to the safety and well-being of others. As he reached his door, Andreas touched the gold Swissair wings pinned inside his flight bag, Marcus Reinhardt's father's wings, now his to carry. They were a reminder of the chain connecting past to present to future, a symbol of the unbroken tradition of aviation professionalism. He smiled, opened the door, and stepped inside, leaving the rain and the memories behind, ready for whatever tomorrow's flight would bring. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below.